I'm so sorry, Miss Hartley.
Oh my God, she's pregnant.
Do you have any idea what this dress cost?
It was an accident.
Then make sure it never happens again. Someone needs to stop her. She's the senator's daughter. Nobody's ever told her no a day in her life.
That's exactly the problem.
One day, she's gonna cross the wrong person.
That was the woman the whole country thought they knew. Before you go any further, if you have not yet watched part 1 of this story, pause here and find it on the NovaDiary fiction channel, because everything you are about to see was built on the wreckage of what happened there, and it will land harder if you know how it began. For everyone returning, let us remind you where we left them. Marlowe Hartley was the senator's daughter nobody could stand, married against her will to Cassius Lockhart, a billionaire who refused to fear her. 2 families had traded their children like assets. What began as pure hatred slowly, quietly, became something neither of them had planned for, right up until the night a car ran her off the road and the night a bomb tore through his parking garage. 2 attacks, 2 survivors, and one truth neither could escape any longer. Because by the time the smoke cleared in that garage, Marlowe and Cassius were no longer asking whether they could survive each other. They were asking who wanted them both dead, and why. Somebody close enough to know their schedules, their movements, the exact minute her car would be on that road, and his would be in that garage. Somebody who had smiled at their wedding. Somebody who had sat at their table. Marlowe still remembers what she whispered to herself in the ambulance that night. Her hands wrapped around the collar of a man she had spent 6 months claiming to hate. I don't even know who I'm supposed to be afraid of anymore. She had spent her whole life believing she was the most dangerous person in any room she walked into. She was about to learn how wrong that belief had always been. They released Cassius from the hospital first, then her, 2 days after the bombing, with a bruise blooming along her ribs and a silence between them that felt different than every silence before it. For 6 months, they had lived in the same house like 2 blades in the same drawer, careful never to touch. Now Cassius carried her overnight bag to the car without being asked, and Marlowe let him, and neither of them commented on how strange that was. The drive home was quiet. Not the cold quiet of the early days, but something more fragile, like both of them were afraid that saying the wrong thing might break whatever had shifted in that garage. Marlowe watched the city slide past the window and thought about the second she had heard the explosion, the way her body had moved toward him before her mind had even caught up. She still remembers exactly what she felt on those stairs, running down 4 flights in bare feet before she understood why. I wasn't thinking about myself. I was only thinking about him. It terrified her more than the bomb had. When they reached the house, Cassius finally spoke, his voice low and even in the way it always was when he was deciding something. "We can keep pretending this is 2 separate accidents," he said. "Or we can admit somebody planned both of them and start acting like it." Marlowe set her bag down slowly. "You think they'll try again?" It wasn't a question. "I know they will," he answered. "People who fail twice don't stop. They get more careful." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw that the man everyone called ruthless was, for the first time, afraid of losing something. She just wasn't sure yet whether it was her or only the war he refused to lose. By the following morning, they had made a decision without ever formally announcing it. They would stop waiting to be attacked and start hunting the person doing the attacking. Cassius had resources most governments would envy: private security, forensic accountants, people who could find a payment 3 shell companies deep. Marlowe had something he didn't. She had a lifetime of watching powerful families lie to each other over dinner, and a father whose political machine reached into rooms money alone could never buy. "You handle the people who move money," she told him over coffee neither of them drank. "I'll handle the people who move influence. Between us, there's nowhere for them to hide." Cassius studied her across the table, something almost like respect flickering behind his eyes. "You've done this before," he said. "I grew up in it," she answered. "I just never had a reason to use it for something that mattered." It was the closest thing to a confession she had ever offered him, and he knew it. What neither of them said aloud, though both of them felt it, was that the terrace still hung between them, that single night 3 weeks earlier, when the careful distance had collapsed into a kiss neither had planned and neither had mentioned since. Marlowe still remembers the discipline it took to keep her voice steady across that table. Don't look at his mouth. Don't think about the terrace. Think about staying alive. Cassius finally broke the silence with the only thing that felt safe. "Where do we start?" And Marlowe, who had spent her whole life noticing the people others overlooked, found her mind drifting, unbidden, to a face she had been seeing far too often lately. A cousin who kept appearing in rooms he had no reason to enter. A cousin who had smiled and taken a folder from her hands. "We start," she said slowly, "with the people nobody suspects." Here is the thing about powerful families that outsiders never understand. The danger is almost never the person shouting at the head of the table. It is the quiet one against the wall, the one everybody has stopped noticing, the one who has spent years being underestimated and has learned to love the cover it gives them. Marlowe knew this because she had once been that person, a little girl in a house of 14 rooms, learning that being overlooked was its own kind of weapon. So when she began, quietly, to make a list of everyone who had known both her schedule and Cassius's, she was not looking for enemies who hated them loudly. She was looking for the ones who smiled. And two faces kept surfacing that she could not entirely explain away, no matter how many innocent reasons she invented for them. The first was her cousin Roman, who had been appearing at her father's offices for months under the banner of helping with campaign finances, a subject he had never once cared about in his life. The second she did not yet suspect at all, because nobody did. Vivienne Lockhart was the most beloved woman in either family, the granddaughter who sent flowers, who remembered every birthday, who ran a children's charity and cried at commercials. Cassius trusted her completely. That, it would turn out, was exactly the point. Marlowe still remembers the unease she could not name in those first days, the way her instincts kept circling back to Roman while something quieter tugged at the edges of every conversation. I kept feeling like I was reading only half of a sentence, and someone had torn away the rest. She said nothing yet. She had learned long ago that an accusation without proof only warns the guilty. So she watched, and she waited, and she let them believe she saw nothing at all. There were quieter moments in those weeks, too, the kind that never made the papers. A morning when Cassius came down to find Marlowe already at the kitchen island, with 2 cups of coffee poured, one slid wordlessly to his side of the counter, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at it like it was something rare. "You made me coffee," he said. "Don't make it strange," she answered without looking up. "You take it black. It's not a love letter." But it was, a little, and they both knew it. And he came and stood close beside her while they drank, shoulders touching, saying nothing, and it was the most married either of them had ever felt. If Marlowe's weapon was patience, Cassius's was precision, and in the weeks after the bombing, the world got its first real look at what he was willing to do when someone he was protecting came under threat. It began with a financial journalist, a man named Prescott who had built a career on wealthy people's secrets and had decided the attacks on the Lockharts were his next headline. He started calling associates. He started asking questions about Marlowe's past, her scandals, whether the marriage was a cover for something uglier. He wanted a story, and he did not much care who it destroyed to get it. Most men in Cassius's position would have sent lawyers. Cassius sent nothing at all, at first, which was somehow worse, because Prescott did not understand the silence until it was already closing around him like water. Within 9 days, the journalist's primary funding source withdrew without explanation. His publisher discovered an old contract irregularity that had never mattered until suddenly it did. When Prescott finally requested a meeting, half panicked, Cassius agreed and let the man sit across from him in that glass office and sweat. "You built a career crawling through other people's garbage looking for something shiny," Cassius said, his voice never once rising above conversational, which somehow made it worse. "And you thought you'd crawl through mine, through hers." He slid a folder across the desk. "That's every debt you've hidden, every source you've paid, every lie you've printed and prayed no one would check. You are a small, hungry man who mistook my silence for weakness. Let me correct that mistake for free." Prescott's hands shook as he opened it. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand that you are nothing," Cassius said. "You will never write my wife's name again. You will never write mine. And if you so much as think it, I will take that grubby little career you're so proud of, and I will erase it so completely your own mother will struggle to remember what you did for a living." Prescott swallowed hard. "Is that a threat?" Cassius finally looked up, and his eyes were flat and cold as winter glass. "It's a mercy. You should take it before I change my mind." Marlowe was not in the room, but she heard about it, the way people always heard about it, and something warm and dangerous turned over low in her chest. He had done that for her. Only for her. She still remembers the exact thought that startled her that night. "I have spent my whole life being feared. I never once knew what it felt like to be defended, and God help me, I liked it." The second time she saw it, she was standing right beside him, and it changed something she could not undo. They were at a donor reception for her father's campaign, the kind of glittering, high-ceilinged evening where everyone smiles and nobody means it, when a business associate of Conrad's named Holloway had too much to drink and decided Marlowe's reputation made her fair game. He leaned too close. He said something about her past, something crude, something designed to make the men around him laugh at her expense. For a moment, Marlowe felt the old instinct rise, the urge to cut him down herself with a sentence sharp enough to draw blood, because that was who she had always been. But before she could speak, Cassius was simply there, between her and Holloway, having crossed the room without appearing to hurry at all. He did not shout. He never shouted. He set his glass down on the nearest table with a soft click that somehow silenced the whole cluster of guests, and he looked at Holloway the way a man looks at something he has found on the bottom of his shoe. "Look at you," Cassius said quietly, and every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Drunk on a free bar, mistaking a room full of people too polite to laugh at you for people who respect you. You opened your filthy mouth about my wife. My wife." He took a single step closer, and Holloway actually flinched. "Here is what you're going to do. You're going to apologize to her, and you're going to mean it. And then you're going to take your sweating, stumbling, worthless self out of this room before I decide to make an example of you that the rest of these good people will talk about for years." Holloway tried for bravado. "Or what?" Cassius smiled, and it was the coldest thing in the room. "Or I stop being the most patient man you've ever met and become the last one you ever crossed. You have 10 seconds. I'd spend them apologizing, not talking to me." The man apologized. The man's voice shook while he did it. The man left, and Marlowe, standing in the ruins of a moment she had expected to handle alone, felt something she had spent 26 years believing she did not need: protected. She still remembers what she thought as she watched him straighten his cuffs, like nothing had happened. "No one has ever stood in front of me before. Everyone always stood behind me, waiting to see what I'd do. He stood in front." That night they drove home in a silence that had changed temperature entirely. Marlowe kept stealing glances at the man beside her, this cold, controlled creature the world called heartless, and finding that she no longer believed the word applied to him at all. He had a code, she was beginning to understand. He never humiliated the weak. He never raised his voice at people who couldn't fight back. He saved his ruthlessness for the ones who earned it, and he had never once, in 6 months, turned it on her, even when she had deserved it, even when she had been cruel enough to earn it 100 times over. Marlowe still remembers the exact moment the truth arrived, quietly, while she watched the city lights slide across his face. Oh no, I feel something. And I don't know how to stop it. When they reached the house, Cassius walked her to her door out of habit, and they stood there a moment too long, close enough that the air between them felt like a held breath. You didn't have to do that tonight, she said softly. I know, he answered. You could have let me handle him myself.
Because I'm tired
I usually
of watching
do.
you fight alone.
I know that
You don't have to do
too.
it in this house.
She looked up at him. Then why? And Cassius, who measured every word like it cost him something, was quiet for a long moment before he said the truest thing he had ever said to her. Because I'm tired of watching you fight alone. You've been doing it your whole life. You don't have to do it in this house. Marlowe felt her throat tighten in a way she hated, in a way that felt like losing. She said goodnight before the feeling could turn into words, and she closed her door, and she leaned against it in the dark, and for the first time in her adult life, Marlowe Hartley did not know what she wanted, only that she wanted it badly enough to be frightened. The invitation came on a Thursday, embossed and formal, a request from Senator Conrad Hartley for his daughter to attend a major campaign fundraising dinner, the kind of event where a candidate's family is meant to stand and smile and remind the donors that the man they're funding is a devoted husband and father. It was, of course, a performance. Conrad had never once wanted Marlowe present for her own sake. He wanted the optics of a reconciled family after a year of scandal, wanted the photographs of his daughter and her billionaire husband looking respectable and united. Marlowe read the invitation twice and felt the old familiar bitterness rise, the knowledge that to her father she had always been an asset first and a daughter a distant second. He wants us there for the cameras, she told Cassius, handing him the card. He doesn't care if I come. He cares how it looks if I don't. Cassius read it, his jaw tightening in that small way she had learned to recognize. Then we go, he said, but we go on our terms. He did not like it, and he told her why, and his reasons were the reasons of a man who had already survived 2 attempts on their lives. Every person who has tried to kill us knew where we would be, he said. Public events are how they found us both times. A campaign dinner is 1,000 strangers in one room, half of them with a reason to hate your father, all of them knowing exactly where you'll be standing and when. Marlowe understood the risk. She understood it completely. What she did not know, what neither of them could have known, was that the danger that night would not come from 1,000 strangers. It would come from the 2 people in that room they trusted most, working a plan that had been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of crowd. She wore deep sapphire that night, a gown built like armor, and when she came down the stairs, Cassius went still in a way that told her more than any compliment could have. They arrived together, her hand resting in the crook of his arm, and for a few hours they played the parts the evening required, the reconciled couple, the family healing in public view. Conrad worked the room like the professional he was, shaking hands, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, steering donors toward the tables where their money was expected. Roman was there, as he always seemed to be now, moving quietly along the edges of the room, and Vivienne arrived late and luminous, kissing cheeks, pressing hands, the most beloved woman in any space she entered. Marlowe watched her cousin and her husband's cousin cross paths near the bar, watched them exchange the briefest of pleasantries, and thought nothing of it, because that was exactly what she was meant to think. For a little while, though, The performance became something real. Cassius pulled her onto the dance floor because the moment called for it, and then forgot the moment entirely, holding her closer than the cameras required, his hand warm against the small of her back. "You're staring," she murmured. "I'm allowed," he answered. "You're my wife." It was the first time either of them had said the word without irony, without the bitterness that had coated it for 6 months, and it landed between them like a small, dangerous truth. "Careful, Lockhart," she said softly, though her heart was doing something traitorous in her chest. "People will think you actually like me. Let them think it," he murmured against her ear, his hand spreading warm across her back. "It's the first true thing they'll have printed about us all year." She pulled back just enough to search his face, looking for the joke, and found none. "You mean that?" "I've stopped saying things I don't mean to you," he said simply. "It's exhausting, and you see through all of it anyway." Marlowe still remembers the way her heart betrayed her in that instant, spinning slowly under the lights in the arms of a man she was no longer pretending to hate. "This is the safest I have ever felt in my entire life, and it's happening in the most dangerous room I've ever been in." She should have paid more attention to the second half of that thought. She should have noticed when Roman slipped out a side door. She didn't. She was looking at Cassius. It happened in the space of a song. Marlowe excused herself to the powder room, the way anyone does at any event, and Cassius let her go because the room was full of her father's security, and there was no reason on earth to follow her down a carpeted hallway lined with staff. She remembers the hallway. She remembers the sound of the party thinning behind her, the click of her own heels on marble, and then a service door opening where no service door should have opened, and a cloth pressed hard against her face that smelled of chemicals and ended the world in a slow gray wave. She remembers thinking, in the last clear second before the darkness took her, a single name, not her attackers, his, Cassius. Her mind reached for him the way a falling person reaches for a railing, and then there was nothing at all. Back in the ballroom, Cassius knew something was wrong before he could have explained how. 10 minutes became 15. 15 became a cold certainty settling into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He found the powder room empty. He found the service door unlocked. He found a single sapphire earring on the marble floor of that hallway, and when he picked it up, his hand was not shaking, because men like Cassius do not shake. But something behind his eyes went very quiet and very dark, the way the sky goes quiet before the worst kind of storm. He walked back into that glittering room full of donors and cameras and his wife's smiling father, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not cause a scene. He simply found the head of security, showed him the earring, and said 6 words that emptied the man's face of color. "Someone took my wife. Find her." And then, under his breath, to no one, to himself, to whoever had done this, "You're already dead. You just don't know it yet." Here is what most people would have done. They would have called the police, and waited, and trusted the system to work, and prayed. Cassius Lockhart was not most people, and he did not have the luxury of faith in systems, because the systems had never once saved anyone he loved. Within 20 minutes, his private security had pulled every camera feed from the venue. Within 40, they had a partial plate on a service van that had left through the loading dock during the exact window Marlowe vanished. And within the hour, Cassius was in the back of a car moving through the city at speeds that should have killed them all, refusing every suggestion that he wait for professionals, refusing to sit still while the only person who had ever slipped past his defenses was somewhere in the dark, afraid. "Sir, you should let the authorities handle the entry," his security chief said carefully. "If it's who we think it is, they'll be armed." Cassius did not look up from the tablet tracking the van's last signal. "Then so will I," he said. The search stretched past midnight, then past 2, then past 3, and with every hour that passed without a signal, something in Cassius that had never once broken began to crack open. In front of his men, he stayed granite, giving orders, reading maps, refusing to rest, refusing to eat, refusing anything that looked like weakness, but alone, for the 90 seconds it took him to walk from one command vehicle to the next, he allowed himself the only privacy he had left. He stood in the dark behind a parked car, both hands braced against the cold metal, and he wept, silent and fast, the way men do when they have never learned how and are terrified of being seen doing it. Please, he said to no one, to whatever might be listening, his voice barely a whisper. Please let her be alive. I will give away everything I own. I will burn the company to the ground. Just let her be alive. He had never prayed in his life. He was not sure he believed in anything that could hear him. He prayed anyway, because for the first time since he was a boy standing at his parents' grave, Cassius Lockhart was afraid of losing something he could not simply buy back. He still remembers the terror of that thought more than almost anything else that night. I have spent my whole life making sure nothing could touch me. She is the only thing that was ever going to be able to destroy me, and I let her in anyway, and now I might lose her before I ever told her what she means to me. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, straightened his jacket, and walked back into the light before anyone could see that the most feared man in the city had just been on his knees in the dark, begging for a woman he had married as a stranger and could no longer imagine living without. He still did not know who had taken her. That was the part that would haunt them both later. The fact that even then, racing through the dark to save her life, he had no idea the plan had been drawn up by people who had eaten at his own table. What he knew was simpler and older than suspicion. Someone had taken what was his, and he was going to take it back, and he was not going to be gentle about it. Marlowe, waking slowly in a cold room she did not recognize, wrists bound, head throbbing, would spend those hours believing she was alone, believing no one was coming, because that was the story her whole life had taught her to expect. She still remembers the exact thought that circled her mind in that dark room like a trapped bird. No one has ever come for me, not once. Why would he be any different? She was about to learn just how different he was. They had taken her to a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, the kind of place chosen precisely because no one would hear anything that happened inside it. When Marlowe fully came to, her hands were bound in front of her, and two men she did not recognize were speaking in low voices near a doorway, and the fear she felt was not the sharp, bright panic of the movies, but something heavier, colder, the slow understanding that she might actually die here, in this filthy room, for reasons she did not even understand. She did what she had always done. She hid the fear. She lifted her chin and she made her voice sound bored, imperious, the senator's daughter who had frightened grown men her entire life. Whatever you're being paid, she said, I'll double it, triple it. I have more money than the person who hired you will ever see. One of the men laughed. That's the thing about you people, he said. You think everything has a price. Everything does, Marlowe answered. You just haven't heard mine yet. But the bravado was a shell, and beneath it she was doing math that terrified her, calculating how many hours she had been gone, whether anyone had even noticed, whether Cassius had assumed she'd left the party angry, whether she would become just another headline about the Hartley girl who finally crossed the wrong person. She still remembers the precise moment the shell cracked, alone in that room while the men stepped out, when she finally let herself feel it. I don't want to die pretending I don't care about anyone. I don't want the last true thing about me to be that I was cruel. And then, softer, the thought that surprised her most of all, I never told him. I never told him what he's become to me. She was crying by then, quietly, furious at herself for it, when the first gunshot cracked somewhere beyond the door, and the whole world changed. The men near the door barely had time to react. What came through that warehouse in the next 90 seconds was not a rescue in any gentle sense of the word. It was a reckoning, cold and efficient and absolute. A man who had spent his whole life being underestimated, arriving to collect a debt. Marlowe could not see most of it from where she sat bound in that back room, but she heard it. The shouting, the scuffle, the terrible decisive quiet that followed, and then footsteps, fast and certain, and then the door was open and Cassius was there, blood on his sleeve that was not his own, his eyes wild in a way she had never seen from a man who was never anything but controlled. For one endless second they simply stared at each other. Then he crossed the room and dropped to his knees in front of her and took her bound hands in both of his, like they were something holy. "I've got you," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word, this man whose voice never cracked. "I've got you. I'm here. I've got you." He worked the bindings loose with hands that finally were not steady, and when her wrists came free, Marlowe did the only thing her body knew how to do anymore. She fell into him. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder and let herself shake, and he held her so tightly it hurt, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because there was nothing that could possibly be enough. She still remembers the first full sentence she managed, muffled against him, the truest thing she had. "I thought no one would come. I always thought no one would come." And Cassius pulled back just enough to look at her, his own eyes wet, and said the thing that undid her completely. "I will always come for you. Do you understand me? Always. There is no version of this world where I don't come for you." He was crying by then, openly, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust and grime on his face, and he did not try to hide it or wipe it away or apologize for it, because there was no version of himself left to protect anymore, only the truth of how close he had come to losing her. Marlowe reached up and pressed her palm to his cheek, feeling the wet warmth of it against her skin, and something in her chest broke open completely at the sight of this man, this fortress of a man, undone entirely because of her. "You're crying," she whispered, wondering. "For you," he said simply. "Only for you." And then he kissed her, both hands cradling her face like she might shatter, nothing at all like the careful, startled kiss they had shared on the terrace weeks earlier. This one was deep and desperate and unhurried all at once, tasting salt and relief, and 6 months of a war neither of them had wanted to fight against each other. She kissed him back with everything she had been too afraid to say out loud since that terrace, and when they finally broke apart, foreheads pressed together, both of them breathing like they had run for miles, neither one of them had any doubt left about what this was. Not a marriage of convenience, not an arrangement, something that had started with a single unplanned kiss weeks ago and had just become something neither of them could imagine living without. He carried her out of that warehouse. She could have walked, and she told him so, and he ignored her completely and carried her anyway, through the wreckage of what he had done to reach her and out into the cold night air, and she let him, because some part of her that had been clenched tight her entire life had finally, in that dark room, come loose. In the car, she could not stop touching him. His hand, his jaw, the blood drying on his sleeve, needing the physical proof that he was real and she was safe, and this was actually happening, and the kiss in that ruined warehouse had not been a moment of desperation that would fade with the adrenaline. "You're hurt," she said again, quieter this time, her thumb tracing the dried blood at his cuff. "It's not my blood," he answered. "Most of it." She laughed, a wet, broken sound, and he pulled her closer against his side, pressing his lips to her hair, to her temple, unable and unwilling to stop touching her now that he had her back. She rested her head against his chest and felt his heartbeat, still too fast, still catching up to the fact that she was alive and breathing and here. "Say it again," she murmured. Say what? That you're not letting me go. He tilted her chin up with 2 fingers and looked at her like she was the only fixed point left in a world that had nearly come apart. I am never letting you go, he said. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not for the rest of whatever life we have left to spend together. He kissed her again, slower this time, unhurried, both of them finally believing it was real. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard, and he said her name like it was the only word he knew. Marlowe. Just that. And she, who had spent her life needing to have the last word, the cutting word, the word that kept everyone at a distance, said the only thing left in her. Take me home. He did. And that night, for the first time since a stranger's signature had bound their lives together, they were not 2 people performing a marriage. They were simply 2 people who had almost lost each other and hadn't, and had no intention of pretending otherwise ever again. By morning, it was everywhere. A senator's daughter abducted from her own father's campaign fundraiser was the kind of story no network could resist. And by 7 a.m., every major outlet was running some version of the same headline, breathless and speculative, running old photographs of Marlowe from the slap video beside new ones of Cassius carrying her from the warehouse. The 2 images stitched together into a single narrative the public couldn't stop consuming. Reporters camped outside the Lockhart estate gates within hours. A helicopter circled overhead until Cassius's lawyers got a restraining order by mid-morning. For the second time in less than a year, Marlowe Hartley's face was on every screen in the country. Except this time, the story wasn't about who she had hurt. It was about who had tried to hurt her. Conrad Hartley held a press conference at 9 a.m. sharp, and Marlowe watched it from a hospital bed she hadn't wanted to be in, Cassius's hand wrapped around hers the entire time. Her father stood at a podium with an expression carefully arranged into fatherly devastation, and he spoke for 4 minutes about his daughter's courage, about how grateful he was she was safe, about how this only strengthened his resolve to fight for a safer country for every family. Not once did he mention calling the hospital. Not once did he mention driving there himself. Marlowe watched her own father perform grief for cameras while she lay in a bed 40 minutes from his podium, and she felt something old and familiar and exhausted settle back into her chest. He hasn't called, she said quietly. Cassius's jaw tightened. I noticed. Has anyone from his office reached out at all? His chief of staff sent flowers, Cassius said, and the flatness in his voice said everything else he wasn't saying out loud. Marlowe still remembers the thought that surfaced, unbidden and unsurprised. Even this, even nearly dying. And he still couldn't make it about anyone but himself. By early afternoon, when Conrad finally did appear at the hospital, trailed by 2 aides and a photographer he hadn't quite managed to leave behind, Marlowe was already being discharged. He stood in the doorway of her room, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. You look well, he said finally, which was, Marlowe thought, an almost impressive way to open a conversation with someone who had been kidnapped 17 hours earlier. I'm alive, she said. That's different from well, but I'll allow it's an improvement over the alternative. Conrad's mouth thinned. The campaign has taken a hit. Donors are asking questions about security at our own events. Marlowe stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part where he asked how she was actually doing, the part that never came. Of course they are, she said. Wouldn't want anyone to think you can't even keep your own daughter safe. She watched something flicker behind his eyes, something that might have been shame in a different man, and then it was gone, replaced by the practiced composure that had carried him through 30 years of public life. Cassius, standing just behind her shoulder, said nothing, but his hand found the small of her back, steady and present in a way her father's hands had never once managed to be. For 6 months, they had woken up in separate rooms at opposite ends of a house built for a family that did not exist. The morning after the warehouse, Marlowe woke with her head on his chest and his arm around her, and the immediate, instinctive panic of someone who had spent her whole life expecting warmth to be a trap. She lay very still, listening to his heartbeat, waiting for the old voice in her head to tell her this was weakness, that caring was a door people used to hurt you, that she should get up and rebuild her walls before he woke. The voice came, the way it always had, but this time, for the first time, another voice answered it, quieter and surer. He came for you. He carried you out. He bled for you and asked for nothing. Maybe not everyone is your father. Maybe not every open hand is a fist waiting to close. When Cassius woke, he did not reach for his phone, did not retreat into the cold efficiency that armored him against the world. He looked at her like he could not quite believe she was still there, and he brushed a curl back from her face with a gentleness that seemed almost foreign on a man that dangerous. You stayed, he said. It's my house too, she answered, and he huffed a laugh, low and warm against her hair. That's not why you stayed. No, she admitted. It's not. He pulled her a little closer, tucked her head beneath his chin, and for a while neither of them spoke, two people who had spent months armored against each other, learning the strange new language of simply being held. Say something ruthless, she murmured against his chest. You're making me nervous being sweet. I'm never sweet, he said. You're being sweet right now. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. She felt him smile. You are the single most infuriating thing that has ever happened to me, he went on, and his hand traced slow along her spine. And if anyone tries to take you from me again, I will burn down whatever they love until there's nothing left but the sound of them regretting it. Is that better? Marlowe laughed, a real one, surprising them both. Much, she said. Do that part again later. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Later, he agreed. Over coffee that they actually drank this time, the world crept back in. Because it always does. The questions had not gone away. Someone had still tried to kill her twice. Someone had still known exactly where she would be. And as Marlowe watched her husband's face harden back into the man who would burn the world down to protect her, she felt the first thread of a terrible new suspicion pull tight in her chest. The attack had been too precise, the timing too perfect. Whoever had taken her had known the exact minute she would walk down that hallway alone. And only a handful of people on Earth had known that. The security team recovered the service van 2 days later, abandoned and wiped, but not quite clean enough. People who plan murders are always certain they have thought of everything, and they are always, eventually, wrong. In the footwell of that van, wedged beneath a seat, Cassius's people found a prepaid phone, and on that phone was a single string of messages coordinating the timing of the abduction, sent from a number that had been careful, that had used no names, that had assumed it would never be found. But the messages themselves told a story. Whoever had sent them knew the layout of the fundraiser, knew which hallway Marlowe would use, knew the exact window when her father's security would be thinnest. This was not the work of a business rival or a political enemy scanning from the outside. This was someone who had been in that room, someone who had been given the guest list. Someone family. Marlowe stared at the transcript for a long time, and the name that rose in her mind was one she had been resisting for weeks, because to say it out loud was to admit something about her own blood that she did not want to be true. Roman. Her cousin Roman, who had slipped out a side door during the dinner. Roman, who had spent months burrowing into her father's finances for reasons that had never made sense. Roman, who had taken a folder from her hands with a smile and told her not to worry about it. She still remembers the sick weight that settled in her stomach as the pieces turned toward him. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, that I was seeing enemies because I'd been hurt. But paranoia doesn't leave a phone in a van. She did not tell Cassius her suspicion yet, not because she doubted it, but because she had learned the hardest lesson of that world long ago. You do not accuse family until you can prove it, because if you are wrong, you lose them. And if you are right, and they know you know, they stop being careful. And a careful enemy is survivable. A cornered one is not. While Marlowe's suspicions circled her cousin, another figure moved through those same weeks, entirely unseen, which was precisely how she had always preferred to operate. Vivienne Lockhart had spent her whole life being adored, and she had learned young that adoration is the finest disguise a dangerous person can wear. Nobody investigates the woman who runs the children's charity. Nobody suspects the granddaughter who cries at weddings and remembers your mother's birthday. She had watched Cassius fall for his own wife with a patience that would have frightened anyone who understood what they were seeing, and she had understood, before either Marlowe or Cassius did, that this marriage was no longer a business arrangement she could manipulate from the shadows. It had become a real thing. And real things, unlike arrangements, could not simply be dissolved. They had to be broken. Vivienne still remembered the exact moment she had decided Cassius's happiness was a threat to everything she had spent years building toward, though she would never have confessed it to a living soul. She remembered watching him look at Marlowe across a room and thinking, with the cold clarity that had always lived beneath her warmth, he was supposed to stay alone. Alone, he leaves everything to me. Loved, he leaves everything to her. The first plan, the one that had run Marlowe off a road and detonated in a parking garage, had failed. The kidnapping had failed too, and worse, it had driven them closer instead of apart. So Vivienne did what she had always done when force did not work. She smiled, and she softened her voice, and she went looking for a subtler blade. She found it in a memory. She found it in a woman from Cassius's past whose heart he had once broken, a woman who had never quite recovered and who would need very little encouragement to come back and try to break his in return. Her name was Claire Bennett, and once, years before Marlowe ever entered the picture, she had been the closest thing Cassius Lockhart ever had to a weakness. She was the woman who had taught him, brutally, that love was a liability, the one who had sold the private details of their relationship to a tabloid for $40,000 and taught a young, hungry man to seal himself shut. He had not spoken to her in years. So when Claire reappeared, it did not feel engineered, and that was the entire point, because Vivienne was far too clever to make her schemes look like schemes. A chance encounter at a restaurant, a warm, apologetic message, a woman older now, softer, claiming she had spent years regretting what she had done and only wanted the chance to say she was sorry. Cassius, who trusted almost no one, might have seen through it instantly if his cousin Vivienne had not spent weeks gently, casually mentioning Claire's name, planting the idea that people deserve second chances, that everyone makes mistakes when they're young. What Cassius did not know, what he could not have known, was that Claire and Vivienne had met 3 times in private before that restaurant encounter ever happened. Vivienne had found the woman exactly where she expected to find her, bitter and broke, and still nursing a wound to her pride, and Vivienne had offered her a great deal of money and a simple task. Get close to Cassius, remind him what you were, make his wife doubt him, break the thing before it hardens into something permanent. Claire had asked only one question. And if he doesn't want me anymore? Vivienne had smiled her lovely, practiced smile. Then make his wife believe he does. Doubt is just as fatal as truth, and far easier to manufacture. It was, Vivienne thought, an elegant plan. She had always preferred wounds that the victims inflicted on themselves. She simply had not accounted for how much Marlowe Hartley had changed, or for the fact that the woman she was targeting had spent a lifetime learning to read exactly the kind of performance Claire had been paid to give. Marlowe met Claire for the first time at a charity luncheon, One of those bright, brittle afternoons where women in expensive clothes pretend to like each other over salads no one eats. Claire was seated 3 chairs away, and she was beautiful in the effortless way of a woman who has spent her whole life being told so, and within 10 minutes she found a reason to mention that she and Cassius went, as she put it, way back. "We were very close once," Claire said, her eyes never quite leaving Marlowe's face, gauging every flicker. "He was different then. Warmer. I like to think I knew the real him before all the walls went up. It was a small blade, expertly placed, designed to make a wife wonder what version of her husband she had never been given." Marlowe felt it land. She was not made of stone, whatever the tabloids said, and the image of this woman knowing a softer, younger Cassius struck somewhere tender and unguarded. But Marlowe had spent 26 years in rooms exactly like this one, being underestimated by women exactly like Claire, and she had not survived by letting her face betray her. She smiled, warm and unbothered, and she leaned in as though sharing a secret. "How lovely that you knew the boy," she said sweetly. "I married the man, and the man, I promise you, does not spend a single second thinking about who came before me." She let the words settle. "But it's darling that you still do." And she watched, with grim, private satisfaction, as the smallest flicker of frustration crossed Claire's lovely features, because that was not the reaction the woman had been paid to produce. Still, when Marlowe went home that night, the blade did its quiet work in the dark, the way these things always do. She still remembers lying awake beside her sleeping husband that night, close enough to feel the warmth of him and feeling more alone than she had in months, hating herself for the thought she could not stop. She had him when his heart still opened easily. "I had to break down a wall to reach him. What if some part of him is still standing in a doorway I'll never see, holding it open for her?" She turned and looked at his sleeping face, this man who had carried her out of a burning warehouse, and she felt the old poison of her childhood rise, the belief that had shaped her whole life, that everyone she loved would eventually choose someone else, that love was just abandonment that hadn't happened yet. It was not a rational fear, but fear, as Vivienne understood better than anyone, has never needed to be rational to do its damage. It only needs a crack, and Marlowe had spent a lifetime being cracked in exactly this place. Vivienne engineered the next encounter with the care of a woman arranging flowers, making certain that Marlowe would walk into Cassius's office unannounced on precisely the afternoon Claire had been invited there, under a pretext about an old mutual acquaintance. The scene Marlowe walked into was harmless. In truth, Claire leaning against Cassius's desk, laughing at something, her hand resting for just a moment too long on his arm. Cassius was not laughing. His face, had Marlowe been calmer, wore the particular stillness of a man enduring a conversation he had not asked for. But Marlowe was not calm, because she had been primed for exactly this image for weeks, and what she saw was another woman's hand on her husband and a familiarity she had no part in. She said nothing. She simply turned and left before either of them noticed she had been there, and she carried the picture home like a stone in her chest. That night, the fight that had been building for weeks finally broke, and it was unlike any fight they had ever had, because for the first time, it was not about hatred. It was about how much she had come to care, and how terrifying that was, and how much easier rage felt than the naked fear underneath it. "How long has she been coming to your office?"
Twice.
Marlowe demanded, and Cassius, blindsided, answered honestly. "Twice. She wants something. I haven't figured out what yet. She wants you. She can want whatever she likes. Do you want her?" And there it was, the real question, stripped of everything, her voice cracking on the last word in a way that horrified her. Cassius went very still, because he finally understood what this was, and understood that the woman in front of him, the fearless one, the cruel one, was standing in his study, terrified of losing him. Marlowe still remembers the shame and the honesty warring in her chest as the truth spilled out of her. I sounded like every insecure woman I ever mocked, and I didn't care. I would have begged. That was when I knew it had already happened. I was already his. Cassius did not close the distance right away. He let her question hang there, let her see him consider it with the full seriousness it deserved, because Marlowe Hartley had been dismissed and managed and placated her entire life, and he refused to do to her what everyone else always had. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain, and he did not touch her until the words were finished. I spent my whole adult life making sure no one could ever do to me again what she did, he said. I built an entire life around not needing anyone, and then a senator's daughter I never wanted to marry walked into my house and set fire to all of it. He took a step toward her. Claire knew a boy who didn't know better yet. You know the man I became because of her, and you're still here. Do you understand the difference? She had my ignorance. You have my whole self. There is no contest. There was never a contest. Marlowe's eyes were wet, and she hated it, and she did not look away. Then why did you let her keep coming back? Because I wanted to know who sent her, Cassius said quietly, and the words landed in the room like a key turning in a lock. Claire Bennett does not have the money to fly back into my life on a whim. Someone is paying her. Someone wanted you to see exactly what you saw today. And when I find out who, I am going to end them. He closed the last of the distance then, and took her face in his hands, and his voice gentled into something she had never heard from him, something that belonged only to her. You are the only person who has ever gotten past me, the only one, my stubborn, impossible wife. I am not letting anyone, her, your cousin, my family, anyone, take you from me, not while I'm breathing. And Marlowe, who had spent her whole life making other people afraid, finally understood that being loved by a dangerous man did not mean being owned by him. It meant being defended by the most formidable thing she had ever encountered. She kissed him then, and this time there was no fear in it at all. The Claire plan did not merely fail, it backfired, spectacularly, and Vivienne knew it the moment Claire called her, panicked, to report that Cassius had summoned her to his office one final time. He had not shouted. Vivienne's associates never seemed to shout. It was one of the things that made them dangerous. He had simply slid an envelope across the desk, containing every record of the money Claire had received, every meeting she had attended, every lie she had told, and he had looked at her with something colder than hatred. "Do you know what you are?" he had asked her. Conversational, almost gentle, which was how she knew to be afraid. You're a tool. Someone picked you up, used you, and will throw you away the second you stop being useful. And the saddest part is, you were cheap enough to say yes. He tapped the envelope. You sold me to a tabloid for $40,000 once. Now you sold what's left of your dignity for a little more, to hurt a woman who is worth 100 of you on her worst day. He leaned back. You were a mistake I corrected years ago. Consider this me taking out the last of the trash. Get out of my city tonight. Change your name if you're smart, because if I ever see your face near my wife again, I will make what I did to your career look like a kindness. Now get your stupid, used-up self out of my building before I have security drag you out by the arm. Claire had run, and when she called Vivienne weeping to say it was over, that Cassius knew someone had paid her, Vivienne had felt the first true crack in her lifelong composure. She sat alone that evening in her elegant, empty apartment, and she did not weep, and she did not rage, because Vivienne Lockhart had never in her life allowed herself the luxury of losing control. She simply grew very quiet and very still, the way she always did when a plan died and a colder one was born to replace it. She still remembers the exact vow she made to herself in that silence, though no one would hear it for a long time. I have been too gentle. I kept trying to break them cleanly, Without blood on my hands, that was my mistake. Some things you cannot dissolve, some things you can only bury. She had tried to end this marriage without ending a life, and it had cost her everything. She would not make that mistake again. The next time, there would be no ex-girlfriend, no whispered doubts, no elegant manipulation. The next time, Marlowe Hartley would simply die, and Vivienne would be somewhere far away with a perfect alibi and a black dress already pressed for the funeral. She made one call before she went to bed that night, and it was answered on the second ring, because the man on the other end had been waiting for it just as anxiously as she had. Roman arrived at her apartment an hour later, and neither of them bothered pretending anymore, not with each other, not in private. "Your little seduction plan failed," Roman said, pouring himself a drink he didn't ask permission for. "Cassius ran her out of the city." "It taught me something useful," Vivienne answered. "Subtlety is wasted on people who are actually in love. I should have known better." Roman's jaw tightened. "So what now?" "My cousin is 3 days from handing that finance folder to an actual forensic accountant instead of just frowning at it. I don't have the luxury of your patience." "No," Vivienne agreed, "you don't, which is why we stopped being careful." She poured her own drink, unhurried. "A house fire is a tragedy. Nobody investigates a tragedy the way they investigate a bombing. Cassius will be at the hospital with his grandmother. Marlowe will be home alone. It ends that night, and it ends looking like an accident, and by the time anyone thinks to ask questions, we'll both have alibis so clean they'll feel sorry for us." Roman studied her for a long moment, something like awe and something like fear crossing his face at once. "You've thought about this a great deal." "I've thought about very little else," Vivienne said pleasantly. "Do you have the access I asked for?" Roman produced a key card and set it on the table between them, his hand not quite steady. "Staff entrance. Alarm system disabled for the maintenance window Thursday night." Vivienne smiled, and it did not reach her eyes at all. "Then Thursday, cousin, we finally finish what we started." Neither of them said the word murder out loud. Neither of them needed to. Marlowe's file on Roman would eventually find the emails between them, cold and clinical, but it would never fully capture the particular quiet of that room. Two people who had convinced themselves that removing an inconvenient woman from the world was simply good business, sharing a drink like colleagues closing a deal. While Vivienne planned in the dark, Marlowe hunted in the light, and she was very, very good at it. She had never forgotten the folder Roman had taken from her hands months earlier, the campaign finance records with a number that had not added up, the transfer routed through an account no one could quite explain. Now, with Cassius's forensic accountants working beside her, she pulled that thread with the patience of a woman who had learned patience the hard way. What she found unspooled slowly and then all at once. The account was a shell. The shell led to another. And buried 3 layers deep, where Roman had been certain no one would ever look, was a pattern of theft stretching back years, money siphoned steadily out of the Hartley family holdings and her father's campaign, small enough each time to escape notice, vast enough in total to explain a great deal. Roman had been robbing them blind for years, and Marlowe had very nearly caught him once, without ever realizing it. That was the piece that turned her cold. Months ago, before the marriage, before any of it, she had flagged an irregularity in her father's accounts, mentioned it in passing, and thought no more of it. She had not known she was pulling on the edge of Roman's entire secret life, but Roman had known. Roman had understood in that moment that his clever cousin's sharp eyes were the single greatest threat to everything he had stolen, and Roman had decided, coldly, that she needed to be gone before she looked any closer. She still remembers the horror that washed over her as the timeline assembled itself, the car on the highway, the bomb in the garage. It was never about Cassius at all. It started with me. He tried to have me killed because I noticed a number. My own blood tried to erase me over money. She sat very still with that knowledge, and then she did what she had learned to do. She did not scream. She did not confront him. She gathered every document, every record, every irrefutable page, and she began, quietly, to build the box she would one day bury him in. It was meant to be an ordinary evening, if anything in their lives could be called ordinary anymore. Cassius had gone to the hospital to see Eleonora, whose health had been failing by slow degrees for months, and Marlowe had stayed home to finish assembling the case against her cousin. She was alone in the house, save for the staff, when the smell reached her first, sharp and chemical and wrong, and then the smoke, curling under the door of the study like gray fingers. The fire had not started by accident. It had been set with the cold precision of someone who wanted it to look like one, someone who had waited for the night Cassius was gone and Marlowe was alone, someone who had grown tired of clever plans and had decided that a house fire asks very few questions. Marlowe reached the hallway and found it already thick with smoke, the exits between her and the door swallowed in heat, and she understood, with terrible clarity, that this was the third attempt, and that this time she was meant to die. She did not panic, though every instinct screamed for it. She dropped low, where the air was still breathable, and she moved toward the one exit she thought might still be clear, and she called the only number that mattered with hands that would not stop shaking. Cassius answered on the first ring. "There's a fire," she managed, coughing. "Someone said it. I can't reach the front. The whole east wing is gone." And she heard, on the other end of the line, the sound of a man's world ending and reassembling itself into pure purpose in the space of a single breath. "Get to the pool doors," he said, already moving, already running. "The glass ones off the garden. Do not stop. Do not go back for anything. Get to the glass and get out, and I am coming, Marlowe. I am coming right now. Stay on the phone with me." She still remembers his voice in her ear as she crawled through the smoke, the anchor of it, the way he never once let the line go quiet. He kept talking so I'd know I wasn't alone. Even miles away, he made sure I wasn't alone. He drove like a man who had already decided his own life was the least valuable thing in the equation. He was still 10 minutes away when she reached the garden doors, and the smoke had followed her, and the lock had warped in the heat, and for one horrifying stretch, Marlowe could not get the glass to open and thought, with a strange calm, that perhaps this was simply how it ended. But she was not the same woman who had been slapped into headlines a year ago. She was harder now, and softer both, and she had something to live for that she had never had before, and so she picked up a wrought iron chair, and she put it through the glass herself, and she climbed out into the night air, bleeding and gasping and alive. When Cassius's car came tearing up the drive minutes later, he found her on the lawn, on her knees in the grass, coughing smoke into the cold air, and he was out of the car before it had fully stopped. He reached her and pulled her into him, and for a moment he could not speak at all. This man of endless words and colder silences, he simply held her and shook, and when he finally found his voice, it was wrecked. "I heard the line go quiet," he said into her hair. For 30 seconds the line went quiet, and I thought, he could not finish it. Marlowe pulled back and took his face in her soot-stained hands, and she said the thing she had promised herself in that warehouse she would never again leave unsaid. "I'm here, I'm alive, and I love you. Do you hear me? I love you, and I'm done pretending I don't, and I'm done being afraid of it." Cassius went utterly still, and then he kissed her, desperate and grateful and entirely undone. And against her mouth he finally said the words he had been unable to say for the whole of his guarded, armored life. "I love you. God help me, I love you more than I have ever loved anything, and I am going to find who did this, and I am going to make them wish they had never learned your name." They did not get to keep the relief for long. Grief has a way of arriving precisely when the heart is already cracked open and least able to defend itself. They were still in the emergency room hours later, Marlowe being treated for smoke inhalation and a deep cut along her arm, when Cassius's phone rang and the screen read a name he had saved months ago and prayed he would never need to answer: Eleonora's attending physician. Marlowe watched her husband's face change as he listened, watched the color drain from it, watched the man who feared nothing receive the one piece of news the world had left that could still break him. Eleonora was gone. The old woman who had raised him after his parents proved incapable of it. The one person who had loved him before he had money, before he had power, before he was anything but a frightened boy, had slipped away quietly in her sleep while the city burned across town. She had not been alone. A nurse had been with her at the end. But she had not had him there, and Cassius would carry that. He did not make a sound at first. He simply lowered the phone and stood in the middle of that fluorescent hospital corridor with his arms hanging at his sides, and Marlowe, who knew him now better than anyone living, understood before he said a word. "Cassius," she said softly, rising from the bed despite the protests of the nurse. "It's Eleonora, isn't it?" It was not really a question. It was her voice giving him permission to say the thing he could not yet make himself say. He looked at her, and something in his face confirmed it before his mouth ever moved. "She's gone," he said finally, the words coming out flat and hollow, a man confirming the weight of something already crushing him. And then the most controlled, most guarded, most ruthless man Marlowe had ever known simply came apart. His face crumpled like a boy's, and a sound tore out of him that she had never heard, would never forget, and his knees gave, and Marlowe caught him, this enormous, dangerous man, and lowered them both to the cold hospital floor and held him while he wept. She still remembers the exact shape of that moment, the reversal of everything they had been. I spent months believing he had no heart, and here it was, breaking in my arms, the strongest man I ever met, and I was the one holding him up. She held him on that floor for a long time, long after the nurses had discreetly drawn a curtain, long after the worst of the storm had passed through him. He cried the way people cry when they have not allowed themselves to in decades, in great silent heaves that shook his whole frame, and Marlowe did not try to stop it, or soften it, or hurry it along. She simply stayed, one hand moving slow circles across his back, murmuring the small, useless, tender things people say when there are no right words, and she understood that she was witnessing something almost no one alive had ever been permitted to see. Cassius Lockhart, undone. Cassius Lockhart, human. When he finally quieted, he stayed leaning against her, spent, his voice raw and small in a way that would have been unimaginable a year ago. "She was all I had," he said, "before you. She was the only one who ever stayed." Marlowe held him tighter, pressed her lips to his temple, to his hair, held his face in both her hands and made him look at her. "Listen to me," she said, fierce and gentle at once. "You are not alone. Do you hear me? Whatever you believed your whole life, whatever they taught you when they left you, it was a lie. You are not alone, because I am not going anywhere, not ever, not if the whole world burns." "She stayed," she agreed softly, "and she gave me you before she went. However this started, whatever they forced on us, she's the reason I'm holding you right now. So she's still here, Cassius, in this, in us, and I will keep staying long enough for both of us to believe it." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing that, and then he said something that would matter more than either of them yet understood. "She knew something," he murmured. "At the end, she kept a notebook. She'd been keeping it for months. She told me once there were things she couldn't prove but couldn't ignore. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd read it." Marlowe went very still against him. Somewhere in her chest, Two separate threads she had been holding, Roman's theft and the person who kept trying to kill her, began, slowly, to reach toward each other. "Cassius," she said carefully, "I think we need to read that notebook. I think your grandmother may have been the only person in either family who saw the whole picture." They buried Eleonora on a gray afternoon under the kind of sky that seems built for grief, and they did not read the notebook until the night after, when the house was quiet and the guests were gone, and they could face whatever it held without an audience. It was a small thing, leather-bound and worn soft at the corners, filled with the sharp, deliberate handwriting of a woman who had built an empire from nothing and had never once written down a careless word. And what it contained, page after methodical page, was the quiet observations of the most underestimated instinct in the family: dates. Overheard remarks, small inconsistencies in Vivienne's stories, gaps in her whereabouts, a pattern of the beloved granddaughter appearing wherever money moved and vanishing whenever questions were asked. Eleonora had suspected Vivienne for the better part of a year and had said nothing because she too had understood the oldest rule of that world. You do not accuse family until you can prove it. But the final entries were what stopped Marlowe's breath in her throat. In the last weeks of her life, Eleonora had grown bolder, or perhaps only more certain that her time was short, and she had begun writing plainly. One line, dated only days before the fire, read simply, "V. Met twice this month with a man I do not recognize. Same man seen leaving the Hartley offices. If Vivienne and someone on Marlowe's side are working together, then this was never about the company. It is about all of it." Marlowe looked up from the page, her hands trembling, and met her husband's eyes. "The man leaving the Hartley offices," she whispered. "Cassius, that's Roman. It has to be Roman." And in that instant, sitting in the dark with a dead woman's handwriting between them, the two threads finally became one rope, and the shape of the thing that had been hunting them since before they ever fell in love stood fully revealed at last. Vivienne and Roman. Two families, one plan. Marlowe still remembers the cold certainty that settled over her. They didn't just want us dead. They wanted everything we'd leave behind. Knowing was not the same as proving, and both of them understood that a suspicion, even a correct one, was a weapon that could blow up in the hand that held it. So they spent the following days doing what each of them did best. Cassius unleashed his people on Vivienne's finances with the full, cold force of a man avenging his grandmother, and Marlowe finished assembling the case against Roman she had been quietly building for weeks. What they found when they laid it all on the table between them was worse and more complete than either had feared. The emails came first, recovered from a server Vivienne had believed was secure, months of correspondence between her and Roman, careful and coded, but unmistakable once you knew what you were reading. Roman had needed Marlowe gone because she had nearly exposed his theft. Vivienne had needed Cassius alone because a married, loved Cassius meant an empire that would never be hers. They had found each other the way predators do, and they had made a bargain. Roman would handle the money. Vivienne would handle the murders. The final piece was a single message, sent from Vivienne to Roman only days before the fire, and reading it made Marlowe physically ill. "The house tonight. He's at the hospital with the old woman. She'll be alone. Make it look like an accident, and we are finally, mercifully, done with the both of them." Vivienne had ordered the fire that nearly killed her. Vivienne had chosen the night, timed it to Eleonora's decline, used the old woman's dying as cover. Marlowe set the page down with hands that had gone steady because she was past trembling now, past fear, arrived somewhere cold and clear and final. She looked at Cassius, and Cassius looked back at her, and the grief and the love and the fury in that room braided together into a single unbreakable resolve. "We have them," she said quietly. "We have all of it." Cassius nodded slowly. Then we don't call the police yet, he said. First, they need to understand exactly who they chose to come after. First, we take everything from them, then we let the law take the rest. They moved against Roman first, because Roman was the weaker of the two, and they moved against him with a plan that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with control. Marlowe would not be walking into that office alone in any way that mattered. A microphone no larger than a button sat sewn into the collar of her blazer, feeding directly to a car parked 2 blocks away, where Cassius sat with his security chief and a laptop showing her heart rate from a second discrete sensor, refusing every suggestion that he wait somewhere farther away. If anything changes in his tone, in his breathing, in the way he moves, Cassius said, we go in. I don't care if it looks like nothing. We go in. His security chief nodded. Understood, sir. Cassius did not look away from the audio feed once. He had already lost one person he loved to a call he couldn't stop. He was not going to lose another to a room he couldn't see into. Marlowe walked into her father's study where Roman had made himself so comfortable over the months, and she laid a single folder on the desk in front of him, and she watched the color drain from his face as he opened it and understood, page by page, that every secret he had buried had been dug up and arranged in the light. You ran me off a road, she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. You put a bomb in a garage. You tried to burn me alive in my own home. Over money, Roman. You tried to murder me 3 times over money. Roman's mouth worked, searching for the charm that had always saved him, and found nothing. Marlowe, you don't understand. It wasn't... I never meant... Don't, she said, and the single word cut him silent. I have the emails. I have the accounts. I have the message where you and Vivienne scheduled my death like a dinner reservation. That was the sentence that broke something loose in him. 2 miles away, Cassius watched Marlowe's heart rate spike on the screen and felt his own chest go tight. Talk to me, he said quietly into his own earpiece, though she couldn't hear him, a habit he couldn't stop. In the study, Roman's charm finally gave way entirely to something uglier and more desperate. He came around the desk fast, closing the distance before Marlowe could step back, and his hand closed hard around her wrist. You think you get to just walk in here and end me? He hissed, all pretense gone, his grip tightening enough to bruise.
Roman.
I have spent my entire life being the afterthought, the spare, the one nobody bothered to introduce properly at dinner parties. You had everything handed to you, and you still couldn't stand to let me have one thing that was mine. In the car, Cassius was already moving, already out the door, already running, his security chief shouting into a radio behind him. Go! Go now! She's not safe. Move. Marlowe did not flinch, though her wrist screamed under his grip. She held his eyes, and her voice did not shake. Every word you have said in this room for the last 4 minutes has been recorded and streamed live to my husband and his entire security team, she said. They are already coming through that door, so before they do, Roman, tell me the truth, just once in your miserable life. Was it ever really about the money, or was it always about hating me for having something you never did? Roman's grip loosened, not from mercy, but from the sudden understanding of exactly how thoroughly he had lost, and something raw and ugly finally came out of him unfiltered. It was never just the money, he spat. Do you know what it's like to watch you fail upward your entire life? To slap a stranger on camera and still be forgiven because you're the pretty one, the favorite one, while I built something real, and nobody noticed unless it was to criticize it? I took what I was owed, and when you got close to finding it, I decided you'd taken enough from me already. The study door burst open behind him, security flooding in, and Roman was still holding her wrist when they pulled him off her. As they dragged him toward the door, Marlowe found her voice one last time, steady, even though her hands were finally starting to shake with the adrenaline she'd been holding back the entire conversation. "Every asset you own is already frozen," she said. "Every dollar you touched is documented. You will be arrested for attempted murder, not just theft. And when they lead you out of here in front of every person you ever charmed, I want you to remember that the quiet little cousin you never bothered to fear is the one who buried you." Roman twisted against the hands restraining him, still shouting something incoherent about fairness, about being owed, and Marlowe simply watched him go, feeling the last thread of trust between them snap clean for good. Cassius reached her seconds later, pulling her into him so hard it nearly knocked the breath out of her, his hands checking her wrist, her arms, her face, cataloging every inch of her for damage before he could make himself believe she was actually all right. "I told them to move the second his voice changed," he said against her hair, still breathing hard from the run. "I have never been more afraid in my life than the 4 seconds it took me to get through that door." Marlowe pressed her bruised wrist gently to his chest. "I knew you were listening," she said. "I never once doubted you were coming." Vivienne was harder and colder and did not break the way Roman had, and both Marlowe and Cassius had known she wouldn't. This time, the safety net was different, because Cassius understood exactly how she operated. There would be no confession she panicked into, no physical outburst to catch on a recording. Vivienne's danger was quieter and required a different trap entirely. In the days before the meeting, Cassius had already frozen every account she could move money through, revoked every access card, and had a discreet security presence stationed in the building under the guise of routine badge audits. If she tried to run, or tried to reach a phone, or tried to destroy so much as a single file, she would find every door already closed before she reached it. He did not tell her any of this. He simply let her walk into a board meeting expecting to preside, and let her find him sitting at the head of the table instead, and watch the beautiful, practiced warmth drain from her face as she understood. "Hello, Vivienne," he said pleasantly, and let her take in the sight of him in her chair before he continued. "Sit down." "No, not there. That's my table now. Every board seat, every account, every brick of that precious foundation you hid behind for 15 years. I bought all of it. It's mine. You're just a woman standing in a room that used to be hers." Vivienne's composure, the composure of a lifetime, finally cracked at the edges, and she did what Cassius had known she would do the moment she felt cornered. She reached for her phone, fingers already moving toward a contact, some last desperate attempt to trigger a plan he would never let her finish. The screen stayed dark. "It's been disconnected from the network for 11 minutes, Cassius said, not even looking up. "So has your assistant's line, and the burner phone in your desk drawer we found last week. There is no call to make, Vivienne. There was never going to be one." Her hand fell still. "You can't prove anything," she said, though the words came out thinner now, less certain. "I don't need to prove anything to fire you, and I already have proven all of it to everyone who matters," Cassius said, rising slowly. "You spent your whole life smiling so no one would look too closely, playing the good one, the kind one, the granddaughter who cried at weddings. And underneath it you are the ugliest thing I have ever had the misfortune to share a name with. You are wrought in a beautiful dress." He let that land, and something in Vivienne finally gave way, not into panic like her cousin, but into something colder and more honest. "You think I wanted this life to be hers," she said, her voice low and venomous, all pretense finally gone. "I built half of what this family has. I smiled through every holiday, every gala, every board meeting where men twice my age talked over me, and I watched you hand an empire to a woman who slapped a stranger on television for sport. I didn't envy her money. I earned the right to what should have been mine, and you gave it to a girl who got it by being born lucky." He rose, and he buttoned his jacket, and he delivered the words he had crossed a lifetime of grief to say. "You brought my ex back to break my marriage, You ran my wife off a road. You set fire to my house while I sat beside my dying grandmother, and you used her death as your cover. You thought I would be easy to isolate, that a man with walls that high must be hollow inside them. He leaned down, close, his voice never rising, colder than any shout. You were wrong about the one thing that mattered. I was never hollow, I was waiting, and you gave me a reason. Security stepped through the door behind him precisely as he finished speaking, exactly as planned, and he walked out and left her there, in the wreckage of everything she had built. Behind him, for the first time in the whole of the years he had known her, Vivienne Lockhart began to make a sound that was not composed at all. Marlowe still remembers what Cassius told her that night, quietly, holding her in the dark. My grandmother saw her when no one else could. She protected us from the grave. I just made sure her last suspicion became the last word. The arrests came within the week, and they came in the full light of day, because Marlowe and Cassius had decided together that people who had operated so long in shadow deserved to fall where everyone could see. Roman was taken from her father's own campaign offices, in front of the staff he had charmed for months, charged with embezzlement and conspiracy and 2 counts of attempted murder, and the charm that had carried him his whole life did not follow him out the door. Vivienne was arrested at her apartment, still insisting, to the very end, that there had been some mistake, that surely her name, her reputation, her years of beloved charity work would count for something, not yet understanding that those things had only ever been the disguise, and the disguise was finished. The families reeled, the tabloids feasted, and through all of it Marlowe and Cassius stood together, united in a way that would have been unimaginable to the 2 strangers who had spoken empty vows a year earlier. Conrad Hartley, for his part, did what Conrad always did, and salvaged what he could, distancing himself from his criminal nephew with the practiced grief of a professional. But something had shifted there too, quietly, in the aftermath. When the dust began to settle, Marlowe's father came to see her, and for once, he did not lead with the cameras or the campaign. I should have protected you better, he said, awkward with an honesty he had no practice speaking. From him, from all of it, from the start. It was not enough. They both knew it was not enough, that a lifetime of being treated as an asset could not be dissolved by a single late apology. But Marlowe, who had learned a great deal that year about the difference between the people who hurt you and the people who simply failed you, found that she could accept it for what it was. You should have, she agreed. And then, after a moment, but I'm all right now, Dad. I found someone who does protect me. Funny, isn't it? You sold me to save yourself, and you accidentally saved me. The house was rebuilt, the east wing rising new and bright from the ashes of the night that nearly ended everything. And there was something fitting in that. A home that had been forced into existence for the wrong reasons becoming, at last, a home built on purpose. The danger was gone. The names that had haunted them were behind walls now, awaiting trials that would only formalize what everyone already knew. And Marlowe and Cassius found themselves, for the first time since a stranger's arrangement had bound their lives together, simply living, waking without fear, moving through ordinary days that felt like the rarest kind of luxury. Marlowe still remembers the strangeness of that peace after so long braced for the next disaster. I kept waiting for the floor to fall out. I'd spent so long surviving that I'd forgotten a person could just live. One morning she stood at the window of the rebuilt study, watching the garden where she had once put a chair through the glass to save her own life, and she felt her husband come up behind her and wrap his arms around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. "You're thinking again," he murmured. "I'm always thinking. It's why you married me." "I married you because a dying woman ordered me to," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "I fell in love with you entirely by accident. Worst mistake of my life." "Say it properly," she demanded, turning in his arms. Say it like you mean it, not like it's a business loss. Cassius looked down at her, and all the teasing left his face, replaced by something so naked it almost hurt to look at. I love you, he said quietly. Not the way I've loved anything before, because I've never loved anything before. Not really. I built walls my whole life so no one could ever reach me, and you didn't climb them. You just stood outside them until I got tired of not letting you in. You are the bravest, cruelest, softest, most impossible woman I have ever known, and I would set fire to the entire world before I'd let it have you. That properly enough? Marlowe's eyes stung, and she did not bother to hide it anymore. That'll do, she whispered, and kissed him, slow and certain, and she thought about the woman she had been a year ago, the one who slapped strangers and mistook cruelty for strength, and had never once in her life felt safe. I used to believe power meant making people afraid of me, she said quietly, echoing something she had confessed at the very beginning, before she understood any of it. I spent my whole life collecting fear because I thought it was the only thing that would keep me safe. Cassius brushed a curl from her face. And now? Marlowe considered it. Now I think power is having something worth protecting, and someone who'll protect it with you. There is one more thing, and Marlowe had been holding it for 3 days, turning it over in wonder and terror both, waiting for the right moment, though she was beginning to understand that there is never a right moment for news that changes everything. There is only the courage to say it out loud. They were in the garden in the early evening, the light going gold and soft the way it does at the end of the good days, when she finally took his hand and pressed it flat against her stomach and watched his face as understanding arrived. Cassius went very still. He looked at his hand, and then at her face, and then at his hand again, and the man who always had words, who wielded language like a blade, found that he had none at all. Marlowe, he managed finally, hoarse. Are you? Yes, she said, and her eyes were wet and shining and unafraid. In the spring, we're going to have a baby. For a long moment, he did not move, and she watched a dozen things cross his face, joy and terror and disbelief, and a tenderness so vast it seemed to frighten him. And then Cassius Lockhart, the ruthless billionaire the world had feared, the man who had walked through fire, dropped slowly to his knees in the grass in front of his wife, and pressed his forehead against her stomach, and wrapped his arms around her waist, and he made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, the sound of a man who had spent his entire life certain he would never have anything good that couldn't be taken from him, discovering that he had been wrong. A baby, he whispered against her. We made something out of all of it. Out of the worst year of both our lives, we made something good. Marlowe ran her fingers through his hair and looked out over the garden where she had nearly died, at the house that had nearly burned, at the whole ruined and rebuilt architecture of the life they had somehow won, and she felt the last of her old armor fall away for good. A year earlier, Marlowe Hartley had been the most hated woman in the country, a senator's daughter who slapped strangers and mistook cruelty for power and had never once been loved without a condition attached. She had been sold into a marriage to save a career that was not hers, bound to a man everyone called heartless, and told, in effect, to survive it. And she had done so much more than survive. She had been hunted and nearly murdered 3 separate times by the 2 people her families trusted most. She had watched her own cousin choose money over her life, and watched a beloved woman's smile hide a killer's patience, and she had outlasted them both, not with the cruelty she was raised on, but with something she had to learn from scratch. Patience, loyalty, the willingness to love something enough to fight for it. The woman who had begun the story certain that fear was the only real power ended it holding the one thing fear can never buy. If this story moved you, if you gasped or cried or shouted at your screen, tell us in the comments which moment hit you hardest, and let us know what you think became of Roman and Vivienne behind those prison walls. Drop the city or state you are watching from, because we read every single one, and we love knowing where in the world these stories find you. If you are new here, go back and watch part 1, so you can see exactly how these two strangers began, and then subscribe and turn on your notification bell, because at NovaDiary Fiction, there is always another story coming, another family with a secret, another woman the world underestimated, right up until the moment she proved them all wrong. Marlowe Hartley learned the truth the hard way, the truth every one of these stories comes back to in the end. The most dangerous person in any family is never the one raising their voice. It is the quiet one, watching, waiting, holding something in for years, until the day they finally decide to use it. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.